Hey everyone, welcome back to another AskGN. We're getting down to the wire. The last probably handful of videos we'll be shooting here before moving over to the office for shooting. And this one, we've got some good questions, including one asking about when a RIPLTT 2 might happen. So we'll be talking about that today. And as always, leave your questions in the comment section below, and we'll try to get to them for next week. We also have a Patreon bonus episode, so we're shooting 3 today. 2 will go live on the main channel, 3rd one on patreon.com/gamersnexus if you want a bonus AskGN episode. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's new H500 case, which we recently found to have an impressively effective cooling setup that is entirely negative pressure when stock. The H500 is the successor of the S340 and S340 Elite, offering high build quality that's all steel and glass, and cable management features that are also top class for this $70 compact mid-tower case. The H500 is a part of NZXT's new H-series lineup, which also features options for mini ITX, micro ATX, and full ATX builds. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the quick update before beginning this one, as usual, we still have mod mats in stock, getting a little low now, probably going to be placing another order pretty soon, but if you want one, place your order because we typically have about a month hold time while we wait for production once they run out. So we still have them now. They're on store.gamersnexus.net, as are the restocked shirts in most designs, and we have the video card anatomy poster there as well. So let's get into the first question. First one is from Budget Gaming PC, who asked any news on the hashtag RIPLTT challenge, or he said hashtag RIPLLT, but really it's all the same at this point. So I spoke to them about that at LTX. Seemed like a good opportunity. Went up to Alex, who's on Linus's team and is the one who originally did the overclock that we beat. So Alex is the one who was really the challenger and the challengee in this scenario, and went up to him and asked, "Are you guys gonna respond, or what's going on?" So they actually do have some responses planned, but I don't know if it'll happen. So we'll see. I did talk to Alex a bit about it. It sounds like it'll be a lot of fun if he can do what he wants to do. It's just a matter of making sure the timelines work with all the launches coming up, like Threadripper 2, for example. So everyone's got a lot going on with that, and other CPU tests, things like that going on. So we'll see. It seems like they have a rough idea and desire to respond. They just haven't prioritized it yet. So if you want to encourage Alex to work on their RIPLT, or their RIPGN, I guess, response, then I think you just probably tweet at Alex the Great-ish. I think that's his Twitter handle, and let him know you're interested. All right, so next one, I definitely want to do a RIPLTT too, but it's not that much fun if I'm just one-upping myself. So next one is from Xenonuke, who says, AskGN, any update on the limited edition foil shirts? Can't remember if a timeline was given. Yeah, so those were pre-ordered. The update is that we're in production. So they're going to be shipping to us soon, and then they'll be shipping out to all of you. So I don't have a hard timeline, but they're in production now. It won't take too long to make them, and they'll be going out soon. If anyone has questions on that, by the way, email support@gamersnexus.net. That's what the support account's there for, and he can help out further. Next one is from M3LL0, who says, I know that you can't address every question, so I'm going to repeat my last one. I was wondering how different workloads on GPUs can cause different power consumption and temperatures, all of them while showing 100% usage. For example, my overclocked RX 480 Superposition pulls about 170 watts according to GPU-Z, while FurMark just gets about 150 watts. On CPUs, it clearly is related to the instruction set, like AVX, FMA. Are there also different instruction sets on GPU 3D loads? So similar ideas. As far as temperatures more or less correspond with power consumption, but there's one instance here that's a bit different with GPUs. GPU temperature can be influenced by a whole lot of things since there's so much variance between the actual cards that are made. So the VRM, as an example, on GPUs, whether it's a good or a bad one, will heavily dictate thermals in general, including on the GPU, because the VRM surrounds the GPU and also dictates efficiency for 12-volt power. As far as what causes the power consumption differences, instruction set matters, but also things like memory consumption. So how memory intensive an application or a task is will impact how much power is being used, because each of those memory modules takes a couple watts or more, depending on what it is, if it's HBM or GDDR5 or whatever. So each of those modules takes power. HBM a bit less per gigabyte than GDDR5 anyway. And if it's memory intensive, then you've got that consideration. If it's not memory intensive, you have to figure out where's the load coming from. Typically it's the core, but there are power virus scenarios as well. So FurMark would be a great example of a power virus where the clock rates are actually much lower than what the card can achieve. So you might see like 1300 megahertz instead of 2000 in FurMark, but it's still burning really hot, and that's because it effectively behaves like a power virus, the literal power virus, as in a malware that would drive power consumption to destroy a component. So that's the idea. FurMark's a pretty abusive program. It's good for stress testing in some ways, not recommended all the time, but it's fine. But the point is that that particular application really strains the VRMs. And so all of your heat production is coming off the VRMs on that with some core, and depending on other benchmarks, you may have memory bandwidth intensive stuff, you may have memory capacity intensive tests, texture filtration's another thing. So if you're working with a lot of like raw, unfiltered textures, or if you're working with textures that are high resolution, not that compressible, things like that, then you get a lot of memory thrashing, and that increases your power consumption on the memory, where you might have less on the core if the core is sitting around idle waiting for the memory to get kicked into gear. So depending on which component's waiting on the other one, if any at all, then that can impact power consumption too. And then type of workload, of course, matters. So FurMark's the best example, because you can compare FurMark versus 3D graphics versus a game, and they'll all have different power consumption despite being 100% load, and it's because they're doing different things. FurMark abusing the power on the power delivery on the VRM, and games might be working with different shaders. So when you talk about driver optimization, that's a big thing. Is it achieving its the graphics just via unoptimized brute force methods, or have the drivers been optimized to leverage different parts of the GPU? So for example, asynchronous compute with something like Volta, like the Titan V. Async compute does much better on the Titan V than on Pascal, and whether or not that's leveraged depends partially on the game, partially on the drivers, whatever. So that's another consideration too. But basically, it's the type of instruction coming down the pipe impacts how much power is being used, just like a CPU. So everything you said about your CPU example, it more or less applies here, except we have the consideration of all the components surrounding the GPU in a really sort of tight grid. So those can impact the thermals of the GPU too. And I think sustained frequency is a big one for how long a frequency is sustained, fixed, versus how much it's allowed to bounce up and down. That impacts it. VRM efficiency under certain loads, voltage required to sustain that frequency versus the particular instruction being performed. So FurMark, again, higher voltage typically to sustain the frequencies, and all of those greatly impact the power consumption. Fan speed also impacts power consumption. If you allow it to sit auto, then that'll change your your output for power consumption. Next one is from someone whose name is listed as Ihor Hluszok, who said, this is actually Thomas, is how we know him. So Thomas is the individual I met at LTX, the 6th grader who said that he got bored of Linus, started watching us, and then said he got we were no longer in depth enough for him, and he started watching Buildzoid. So he posted another question and said, for the next AskGN, could you explain what BCLK is, and does it require a voltage increase when overclocking it? So BCLK is base clock. As many of you likely know, you have, to get a frequency for a processor, when you look in BIOS, you'll see the base clock, you'll see the multipliers. And then memory also has a multiplier, a couple of other things have multipliers. So those multipliers are being multiplied against something, and they're being multiplied against BCLK. So you have 100 BCLK and a 40 multiplier, then you have 4,000 megahertz frequency, or 4 gigahertz. So that's the basics. It is what the multiplier is multiplied against, and then the product is your frequency. And as for what it is, BCLK basically replaced the front side bus on Intel. So FSB is gone and has been replaced with BCLK. BCLK links a lot of things. So if you change your BCLK speeds, this is why we recommend doing it last typically, because you're pretty likely to introduce more instability just because BCLK impacts the PCIe interface speed, it impacts the memory speed. So if you change BCLK to something like 101 and you have memory at 3,000 megahertz when it's at 100, you increase it to 101, your memory will increase a little bit, not a whole lot, you're typically talking like 50 megahertz or something like that. Depends on what your memory multiplier is. It might be like 2666 or something like that. So 26.66. So those are some ways BCLK impacts things. It's basically I/O pulses per second for stuff like I/O devices that are attached via as PCIe, again, as an example. And then sometimes BCLK is useful because you can get half steps with the frequencies. So if you're stable at 5150 but not 5200 megahertz, then BCLK will let you get 5150. Just you might have to also decrease the memory frequency if it gets kind of tricky, because if the memory is not a good bin and the CPU needs another 50 megahertz or something, then you're starting to suddenly put more strain on the memory as well. So it's not a good bin memory. Then now you have to step down your memory clock to accommodate the extra whatever megahertz increase from the BCLK multiplied by the memory multiplier. And suddenly you're doing a whole lot more tuning to just try and get 50 megahertz in a lot of cases. Now, there are instances where you get far more than that, but for a lot of people, I think that's how BCLK is typically used. And it depends on the board partly and depends on everything else, but the board especially depends on how far you can push BCLK. A lot of the time 101 is pretty achievable. You start pushing like 103, 104, suddenly it's not really that doable with a lot of tweaking or with a particular set of hardware that just happens to work well with it. And that's because, again, you have stuff like the PCIe bus falling off or memory having issues with stability, so it might not even be a CPU issue anymore. So BCLK replaces FSB and is basically it's the clock that all the multipliers get multiplied against, and you can get a bit more frequency out of it. As far as voltage, sometimes we've found that increasing BCLK and decreasing the multiplier allows us to keep a lower voltage than just going straight multiplier. And sometimes just going straight multiplier doesn't even work at a certain point, and you have to do BCLK. So the answer is yes, sometimes you can keep the same voltage and drop your multiplier, but end up with a slightly higher clock just because of how the math works out. Next one, Nnn Sss says, how exactly do video card driver updates improve performance on games over time, especially considering the fact that hardware stays exactly the same? What kind of instructions are added or amended to increase FPS or improve stability? So this is a great question. I have an answer on this, but I'm going to expand on it. So the reason I'm bringing it up here is just to let you know, like we talked about with the 10 nanometer question, that video's done, should be live by the time this one's live. We're going to push this off to an expert, actually driver developers at NVIDIA, and hopefully I can get AMD to comment as well. And if we can, then we can get people who actually do driver development or manage it in the very least, and talk about what they do in probably at medium depth. I don't think they're going to go too deep on it, but they'll give you more than I can from a technical perspective. So I want to push that question off to experts. Hopefully we can get an answer for the next, either, if not next week's, then maybe the one after that. It just depends on timing for everybody. Next one, Swift says, do your motherboards matter anymore? Back in the day, if you had a budget motherboard and an expensive one, your performance would differ, but is that the same with today's motherboards? Example, budget B350 board versus high-end X370 board. So yes, they matter a lot. There's the issue of the VRM. It was the issue of overclocking at all on Intel. So Intel locks down their non-Z boards, so if you're planning on overclocking, then obviously you just can't. So that's pretty easily answered there. If we assume you're not overclocking or you're using AMD, where you can overclock on B350 and X370, you have a VRM concern, so there's an issue of, did the motherboard vendor cheap out on the VRM on their lower end board, and so that may constrain you at some point with your overclock. So there's a huge potential for difference. Let's say you have a really good bin CPU on a good board versus a super cheap board, you might lose 100 megahertz or 200 megahertz off your achievable maximum clock, depending on how good the motherboard's BIOS is, depending on how good the VRM is. The BIOS has probably the biggest impact on everything these days. So a bad BIOS will limit you severely if it's really, truly bad. For the most part, the kind of average to above average and up boards for, I think, the average beginner overclocker, it's not going to make a huge difference, but you'll start seeing differences if there's no VRM cooling, there's a bad VRM heatsink, and you're using a case where you don't have a lot of airflow near the VRM. Then you start having issues with potentially VRM thermal throttling. We've demonstrated it in the past on an Asus board that had no VRM heat sinks. You run into like SVID issues with Intel platforms. SVID on Intel platforms starts coming into play where you have a protocol between the CPU and the VRM components, how they talk to each other. So a MOSFET talking to a CPU says, it's getting too hot, I got a downclock, and then you can get downclocking there. So here's another thing. There's more to this than just FPS. A lot of people think of performance as strictly one number, which is frames per second. That's a little flawed because there are other aspects of performance like power consumption. So a motherboard for actually heat plays with power consumption directly. So here's an example of that. When we reviewed one of Gigabyte's Z270 boards, I think when they first came out, we ended up actually really liking the particular board later, the Gaming 7 Z270 board. But when it came out, it had some issues where the auto V core was just crazy high. Like it was 1.3 or something like that. I can't remember exactly. We had a video and an article on it, but it was something like 1.3 volts to sustain more or less stock. And in that scenario, if you're stock, you're still going to get the same frame rate for the most part as the MSI immediate equivalent, like Gaming Pro Carbon or something like that. You're going to get the same frame rate more or less as the Asus boards. But the difference now is you're chewing through way more power, your temperature's higher, so suddenly you have to run your fans at a higher speed, makes your system louder. It means that you have to, and more power there too, it means you might have to upgrade your cooler, and in general it's just kind of wasteful. So, and also you'll feel like you have less overclocking headroom if you're not particularly skilled with overclocking to spot that auto V-core is blasting through so much power. So that was solved with the BIOS update, to be clear, on Gigabyte's end. But this still happens regularly with motherboards all the time, and there's more to performance than FPS. You could be wasting a lot of power. You could be running hotter than anywhere close to reality should be for the CPU. So 7700K in that instance was something like 90 plus degrees Celsius or thereabouts with the stock settings with auto V-core on that board, whereas any other board that used a sane V-core, like 1.2 to 1.27 or something like that, those at one point, actually 1.18 to 1.2 is about what we found others were running at for stock. Those would be running significantly cooler. So that's a big consideration too. So you have BIOS, you have things like auto V-core, you have other auto voltages, you have limitations, or actually the opposite. You have sort of hidden, I don't know, benefits of MCE, which isn't really beneficial, but if a vendor decided to turn MCE on by default, then it would look like the board's performing better than it does. It's a trick that motherboard vendors play to try and look different from each other and look superior. I'm not presently aware of any that I've worked with lately that are shipping with MCE enabled by default. It seems like they've all turned that off, but I haven't worked with every board. I'm sure there's one out there somewhere. But those are some of the things to consider. VRM quality is a big one. To really sum this up, though, the difference in motherboards, it is something you should care about. If you're not going to overclock in a somewhat serious fashion, then you don't need to stress too much about all the small details, because ultimately there are a lot of small details. And unless you're really, really serious about overclocking, getting like an X299 Dark, as great as it is, might not be something you can appreciate unless you're really using it, and especially on like the memory front where it's a really strong motherboard. So there are absolutely differences in boards. Whether or not you'll ever see those differences depends kind of on how observant you are of things like power, thermals, overclocking, and things like that. There are instances where boards out of box will appear faster or slower than the other. A lot of the time it's because of either something like MCE where they're kind of cheating, or it's because of something like the BCLK, which we talked about earlier in this video. So BCLK, on some boards, just as an FYI, you'll see it bounce between like 98.5 and 101, maybe 101.5, depending on which motherboard you're looking at. So if it doesn't hold steady at 100, you will have performance fluctuation. If you ever see like a 5% change between two boards and it's not margin of error, that's probably what it was. One probably went down to 99.5 and the other one probably held 100. So there are lots of ways motherboards differentiate themselves, and yes, they do matter. Next one, iManny99 said, in your videos you have suggested better temps than foregoing the application of silicone between IHS and substrate after deliding a CPU. One of the points it made with other deliding videos where it's silicone with an E at the end, not silicone, where silicone is applied, is to leave a gap to allow for hot gases to escape. Is that a non-issue since not applying the silicone means completely closed space? Yeah, it's not really an issue. Your biggest concern is not having an air gap, because an air gap will create these hot spots between the die and the IHS underside, and air is less than 1 watt per meter Kelvin at 25C, and copper is 400. So having any kind of hot spot between the die and the IHS is undesirable, even if there are other theoretical benefits like allowing venting of hot air. In reality, what matters most is having contact, and adding silicone adhesive increases the risk of a gap significantly, and also increases the chance that it doesn't settle quite right. A lot of the time, when I delid it and leave the lid loose, 100% of the time these days, it's fine, I can use it straight away. When I delid it and try to reseal it, like we do for other YouTubers, it normally takes me 2 tries with a lot of testing to really get it the way I like it, and you're always going to be a bit hotter than if you don't reseal it. Next one is from, we have 2 left. Galiu says, will there ever be a CPU cooler that comes in one piece with the IHS? Saw the latest AskGN, and he basically said that the fewer layers there are between the cooler and IHS, the better, so why not make a solution that removes all the layers? Someone could delid a CPU and buy a custom cooler for an already delided CPU and just put it on top of the CPU instead of the regular IHS and cooler. So if you're not aware of it, there is actually something called direct die cooling. And it's not that common, so not a lot of people use it. It's more common with the high-end platforms like X299, and Der Bauer makes a direct die cooling kit, for example. It is a low-volume enthusiast part. So not a lot of people talk about this. Direct die cooling is basically what you're asking about, except instead of attaching the IHS to a cooler, it's just removing the IHS from the scenario completely and attaching the die to the cooler via your normal compound, normally thermal paste. You could use liquid metal, but at that point it's not even necessary because direct die contact matters more than anything else. So direct die is what you're talking about, and it requires a mod to the socket. It's pretty straightforward. You remove the socket and then put a new one on. And as long as the tolerance is safe from a good kit, you're not going to crack the die. The reason the IHS is to protect the die from users installing it, cracking the die, stuff like that. So what you're talking about exists. Look up direct die cooling, see if a kit exists for the socket you're using, and maybe give it a shot. Just be aware there's a bit of risk. Follow the instructions very carefully. If it's a good kit, then you'll be fine. And that more or less answers that one. So the last one is TK949, who said, loved the video about Andrew Han's audio room. That's the EVGA CEO. We did a tour of his audio room. If you are allowed to share or elaborate, how was that video crafted? Where did the opportunity come from, and what made you decide to do it? Anything else you might be able to share? So I think as far as how the video was crafted, it was basically, this was, I think, at the end of Computex. It was in his one of his apartments or condos in Taipei, and we basically just talked to him at the EVGA suite. I'd heard about the audio room before, and we thought that would be a really cool video opportunity. So I asked him if we could basically invite ourselves over and asked if we could check it out. And he was happy to show it, because I don't think anyone's done a video on that room before. I'm not an audio expert, but Andrew Han sure knew a lot about what he bought, so we were able to just talk with him and learn about everything in the room and piece it together based on what we could learn from him about the equipment he bought. It's really impressive. It's, again, someone who's not an audiophile, it certainly seems like something that everyone should listen to if you get the chance, because basically it was super directional sound. I was expecting not that, but it's very specific to where you are in the room, so you kind of do like 5 rows back in the middle positioning, and then you can hear the sound sort of come out in like layers, because it is a layered horn. So you've got the tweeter inside of the horn with it goes all the way back, I think 3.1 meters in a big coil, and it has the driver at the end of it, and then there's the subwoofer. So it's very interesting. As far as where did the opportunity come from, again, we'd heard about it from people in the industry who'd listened to the room. One of EVGA's employees had mentioned it to us, and so we wanted to record it because it's old, very cool technology that works well, and you don't find a lot of that, especially in as good shape as it was there. So very interesting tour to do. Anything else I can share on it? I guess he's got he had a couple of books. So he had like a limited around 1,000 unit book that was on all the old Western Electric gear. So it had stuff dating back to like the early 1800s. Pretty cool stuff. And then other than that, I think pretty much what you saw in the video is mostly what we had to say. So yeah, thank you for asking that. It was a very interesting tour, and he seemed like he had done a whole lot of research on the audio equipment. So, oh yeah, we also got this this plaque from Andrew Hahn. So this, I think, came with one of his Western Electric audio pieces that he purchased. And I think when I researched it, I'm pretty sure this was their logo up until like the 60s. I think it was the 30s until the 60s or something like that. So it was made sometime in that timeline. And given on, based on how it was made, it looks like that's about right for the era. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. We had someone email me and they were mad about my phrasing for a few things. Like, I guess I referred to the needle on the record player slightly incorrectly. So if that bothers you, then probably don't watch it. But otherwise, it's really cool stuff. And as always, leave your questions in the comment section below if you have questions for next time. Thank you for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our shirts, mod mat, poster, anything else. We've restocked a lot of things lately. Or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get the bonus episode. We'll be filming in the new office soon, so definitely make sure you subscribe for that. I'll see you all next time.